Alright, challenge running from software games is a rich and diverse tapestry consisting of a multitude of masochistic methods of self-induced flagellation. But whatever form it takes, in essence it's about limiting yourself in one way or another, or even going as far as to take away basic motor functions. But what could be a greater handicap for a weary yet worldly and well-versed weapon-wielding warrior than traversing the battlefield with both of their arms broken and shattered? Unfortunately, in my case, that's a bit of a problem because, as you can see, I don't actually have any arms, given that my hands are just free-floating in the air, and depending on the specific slide in question, may not even be present at all. But fortunately, in Dark Souls 3, you can wield actual arms as well as arms, as in weapons, which allow you to attack with magical twigs or something, which is peculiar but surprisingly powerful. And on top of that, you can use it as a catalyst for sorcery. A very handy type of armament indeed. However, what if both of your arms are broken? That might be quite a different experience. I mean, magic damage is arguably the worst damage type in Dark Souls 3. I guess they overcompensated for how powerful it was in the previous titles. So in order to make a high-powered magic build in this game, you need a very specific setup. And as you might imagine, that would not include casting spells with a broken catalyst. And to make things worse, although the weapon art might appear to be pure magic damage, but for whatever reason, it scales exclusively with strength. And to add insult to injury, they decided to give it a huge D in strength scaling. Well, I'm not sure if I can even handle such a big D, and therefore I think I'm going to have my hands full on this one. But we're going to give it a try and see if I can somehow survive with 2 broken arms in a world in which everyone wants me dead. But now, I think it's time for us to unleash Armageddon. Or instead, discover that a run like this will cost you both an arm and a leg.
Fear not the dark, my friend, and let the feast begin.
Alright, we're on PC, so we can start off with the right equipment, and wow, that doesn't look very flattering. But of course, apart from debatable fashion choices, we may be armed to the teeth, but I might have to stick my foot in my mouth, ironically, once I see the damage output. But actually, to be fair, it's certainly not great, but I do think that it could have been a lot worse. However, that's just the initial impression, because the main issue is going to be that we can't exactly increase our damage by all that much, given that spells are severely affected by the lack of durability, as you will discover later on, and require a massive intelligence investment, or even dexterity for casting speed. And even then, almost nothing will outclass the weapon art, especially given how much more FP it will cost. But when it comes to the weapon art, upgrades and strength scaling will only increase it by a relatively small amount compared to the weapon in its normal unbroken state. I mean, the wiki states that it merely cuts your damage in half, but I kind of question that validity. Well, at least it upgrades with Twinkling Titanite, which you can get free of right at the start, namely 1 from behind the shrine itself, and 2 more by trading with the crows. Yeah, I can imagine that such a sight can make you hesitate. But hesitation is defeat. Oh, crap, we don't have any spells yet. Well, fortunately we can deal with this guy without getting our hands dirty. Lol.
You're in search of the Lords of Cinder, I trust. A toilsome journey, I'd wager. You'll require good arms.
Don't make me slap you! I will slap your face so super hard!
Oh boy, yeah, even after upgrading, these arms are not going to do any heavy lifting. And the worst thing is that it automatically repairs them. Yeah, it's not exactly a good sign when before the challenge even truly gets started, you're already repeatedly punching a wall. Wow, imagine how the Firekeeper must feel, leaving the fate of the world in the incompetent hands of this abomination. Well, despite all of that, this whole setup might look familiar to the cultured and knowledgeable among you, because it featured in this fine classic by Limit Breaker. Although ironically his version was broken in the opposite direction and focused on PvP. By the way, we do actually have another handy move up our sleeves, namely the ability to pimp slap our way through the game.
Good. Now we can fight as warriors. Hand to hand. It is the basis of all combat. Only a fool trusts his life to a weapon.
Yeah, unfortunately, although it looks quite comical, damage-wise this weapon isn't much of a slapstick. And what's even more unfortunate and quite ironic is that I got off on the wrong foot and immediately went towards Vord without picking up the Estus shard first. But, you know, shouldn't be a big deal. After all, you don't get hit if you bravely charge Vord and stick right under the... Did I seriously just get hit? Huh. Well, as I was saying, you can essentially just spam your way through the first phase. However, I was not able to kill him before he finished his ice breath. And then you get into a territory that you rarely need to tread into. I mean, I can count the amount of times that I was forced to deal with his actual second phase moveset on one hand. But the main issue with it is that Vord himself becomes a giant hitbox in his second phase, during almost all of his attacks, including some pre-Elden Ring delayed attacks. So then spamming attacks of your own is not an option. But at least you are still able to attack with 0 FP. However, with an additional damage reduction on top of the 0 durability. But afterwards I went back to pick up the Estus shard and the key to Greyrat's cell, which is a bunch of doggy doo-doo. In fact, that's quite an understatement. But Greyrat will become important later on. And after giving an old lady a helping hand, I went off into the undead settlement where I talked to Yol, at least, come on, wake up you dick. Oh, it's the other one. After all, in the looks department this run is already a lost cause anyway, so I might as well go hollow for some extra levels. But on a side note though, these pilgrims turn into the pilgrim butterflies that we find in Lothric Castle later on. Meaning that they are essentially the larval state of those butterflies when they are still alive. So doesn't that imply that a dead pilgrim's corpse is a pilgrim poopa? Ah, deepest lore. You don't learn that kind of stuff from Vadi, now do you? Also, despite not being able to use any other weapon, I still went to pick up the Cestus, or Kestus, or whatever the correct pronunciation is. I suppose the spiked version in Elden Ring could be referred to as a cactus. But the thing is that the people who have seen my previous playthrough, the no stamina run, know exactly what the power of the weapon art of this leather boxing glove is. And on top of that, it might serve as a parry tool with a simple infusion later on for some additional FP. So then I chose to give Sigurd an actual helping hand, and then helped out myself by acquiring Flint's Ring and the Stamina Ring, as well as an Undead Bone Shard, and of course the 5 free levels from Yol. And given that I had 1,000 souls to spare, and since I didn't have any spells yet, I decided to purchase Farandard. After all, that is a quick spell, so it might be worth it. Weird, by the way, that the spell doesn't actually come from your hand, but from your actual hand. You know, like the hand, not the hand that you're wielding, but you know, the hand that you're holding the hand. You know what I mean. Regardless, let's test out the damage. This run was a huge mistake, wasn't it? And yeah, sorry to test it out on the Firekeeper, that's like biting the hand that feeds you. But here's the thing, as I said before, the wiki says that broken weapons get a 50% damage penalty, but that's apparently just a rule of thumb, because in this case it's closer to a 70% damage penalty. So that kinda raises the question whether spells are even going to be useful at all in this playthrough. Oh. Anyway, that's a worry for later. First I went towards the Abyss Watchers and picked up some helpful stuff along the way. Most importantly, another Twinkle Tit. Now there are a whole bunch of them beyond the Crystal Sage, but that's obviously a bit of an issue when doing magic damage. So unfortunately we cannot truly become armed and dangerous until after defeating the Blood Brothers in Arms known as the Abyss Watchers, who aren't actually all that brotherly towards each other. Well, to be fair, I grew up with a big brother and it's actually quite accurate, but the thing is that I will need to take advantage of the fact that they attack each other, Because my damage output is not all that great. But at least there's one saving grace, because the Abyss Watchers are humanoid and don't have any poise, meaning they aren't very resistant to spam. However, there is a little caveat, because they do have seemingly random moments of hyper armor. And I also noticed that when you attack when you're out of FP, you don't inflict any poise damage, meaning that you require FP in order to stun lock anything. But how much you can spam depends on your stamina, of course. So when going for what normally would count as backstab opportunities, it's best to first let your stamina regenerate right before attacking, and then make sure that you have a little remaining to avoid a potential counterattack, which I didn't do consistently. So there were some arguably unnecessary close calls, but despite some sloppy gameplay on my end, I still managed to finish the fight with both regular and Ashen Estus remaining. Which is good for now, but especially speaking of the latter, the further we get into the game, the more FP efficient we need to be, given that the boss's health and defenses will increase faster in this journey than our damage output will be able to keep up with. Now fortunately we can get another Twinkle Teddy in the Catacombs and one more down in Smoldering Lake, but if we equip the Farron Ring from Hawkwood, we can decrease the FP consumption of our weapon art by 25%, and that's significant. Now, we could only get a single upgrade, but we are capable of acquiring quite a few additional souls before taking on the magic-resistant Crystal Sage. In fact, we can even take a hands-off approach by teaming up with a Mimic and let him do all the legwork, so that we don't even have to lift a finger. Okay, perhaps I should have given him a helping hand. Well, okay, the idea here was good, but the execution was of lesser quality. Now, fortunately, you can also acquire help from several Skull Servants, and although a single one isn't strong, but they can mean trouble in large numbers. Of course, they can also mean trouble if they are simply, large. Although, despite it taking a lot more spamming than usual, Wolnir wasn't all that bad actually, as long as you are aware that you are somehow able to avoid the smoke by standing behind it. Yeah, I don't get it either, but despite how it looks visually, his breath is basically a forward-moving hitbox. And as long as you don't get bad RNG, where he summons skeletons too early on or moves his arms out of reach too often, you can basically stand in front of his face for the most convenient attack opportunities. And to be fair, for his crimes of being a tyrannical conqueror, getting a few slaps on the wrist from the long arms of the law, and then get sent to your room down in the basement is not exactly a severe punishment. Although I'm speaking to an audience of gamers, so depends on your perspective. But what is a more than appropriate punishment for an annoying invading NPC like Hodrick is getting Giant Arrowed to death by the giant arrows of the giant arrow firing arrow giant. But for some reason he didn't attack Hodrick at all. Oh well, in that case I can use gravity to my advantage. Hey Hodrick, mind to get... Oh, what the fuck? What the hell was that?
We can just walk over it? You can just walk over it. You are scum.
Well, at least given the fact that I didn't get an appropriate opportunity to slap giant balls around with a group of like-minded people in the Elden Ring community run, I instead invited the entire town over. And you might think that here, ranged magic projectiles could come in handy, but given that the lock-on points are in the center of the boss, it pretty much just has to happen to line up with your actual target and wow, 1 damage. Oh yeah, that definitely and immediately gave me the upper hand in this fight. But in all honesty, eventually we should be able to find some kind of sorcery that would prove to be useful. So I made sure to get ore back to Firelink, but of course that wouldn't help me against the Crystal Sage. So I thought that a better defense would be the best offense, and given that we know how powerful the Perseverance weapon art can be, to serve as portable poise, but there was an unexpected issue. The weapon art of a catalyst overrides the one from a weapon. So switching with it in my right hand doesn't work this time. And of course in the left hand it parries. Meaning I would have to two-hand it first and then switch back to my 2 hands. Which doesn't make it unusable, but it's definitely less convenient. So I simply had to make sure that I would choose wisely when picking my target. That I would get in front of the real one right after teleporting. At least as much as possible. And especially make sure that I was at full stamina before attacking. But actually, when that didn't happen, the Farron Dart would be useful, since the clones die from literally any damage whatsoever. So all in all, this boss was less of an obstacle than I thought he would be. And with the Crystal Sage out of the way, we not only have access to a whole bunch of Twinkling Titanite, because we can make a little trip into the Painted World as well, but in the Cathedral we can acquire Lloyd's Sword Ring for a 10% damage boost. However, by going into the DLC, we can finally acquire a spell that will actually provide us with a little benefit, namely Snap Freeze. However, having said all that, here I have to include an additional rule for this run. No Pestilent Mist. After all, Snap Freeze has a very limited utility without additional fire damage, whereas Pestilent Mist would be a complete workaround altogether, given that it's unaffected by literally anything. So therefore I'm washing my hands clean of that kind of cheese, well, a little bit sort of cheese I suppose. But actually, more importantly, it would turn the run into essentially an easier version of this old video here. And on top of that, as a Locust, it's uncomfortably close to Pesticide anyway. But speaking of not having any fire damage, all of a sudden the fight against the sentient tree lady, to make the ladder appear, became one hell of an actual fight for survival. I suppose it makes sense that it would be highly resistant to damage from attacks from two silly magical twigs, and extending an olive branch wasn't an option either. For whatever reason, this enemy has to die in order for the ladder to appear. I am still in a dream, Locust preach. Oh, what the actual fuck? Oh my lord. Oh, what the hell? I didn't even know about this. The ladder disappears because the other tree lady respawns after death. So I would have to kill her again. Crabalicious. But at least as I said, our newly acquired spell is quite effective against groups. Aw, snap. But the most effective thing in my inventory were of course the Alluring Skulls, which I acquired from patches. Because after luring all the deacons to the back of the room before making the Archdeacon appear, which I did to buy myself the most time possible with the least amount of enemies around, and then I could constantly distract them while making the Archdeacon intimately familiar with the forbidden tree of knowledge of what is good and what is bad. You know, the strategy I use being the good part, and the bad part is doing this run at all in the first place. Also remember that this arm is one of a preacher, so let me preach the good news to you. You know how in the Bible one of the plagues of Egypt was a swarm of locusts? I suppose it was simply lost in translation, but what was envisioned was a swarm of magic twig spamming locusts like this. In the original Hebrew referred to as locusts. Yeah, I bet you never heard about that back in Sunday school, you filthy heathens. However, the ultimate form of blasphemy, if you ask me, is the fact that you would think that this attack would benefit greatly from the Pontiff's right eye ring, since that would normally be ideal for spam attacks, but for whatever reason the ring only starts to take effect after 5 or 6 hits. And since it goes in tiers, that's rarely going to matter much. And to make things even weirder, apparently the Leo ring, which boosts thrust attacks, but only when doing counter damage, does work with this attack, even though every indication is that it does purely magic damage. After all, the Magic Clutch ring boosts the damage of this attack as well. So it's actually a mixture of magic and thrust because it scales exclusively from strength, but it's also magic but it doesn't scale with intelligence. You know, I long since stopped to make sense of how damage scaling is even supposed to work in these games. So let's not get up in arms about it and just take it for what it is. Regardless, we are actually not limited to solely inflicting magic damage. But in order to get a dark spell, we will have to rescue Uriah the Witch, whose key is further down in the profaned capital. You know, I actually wonder how Gilligan even got here in the first place. I wish I could just sit right back and hear a tale of a fateful trip, but by the looks of things, we'll just skip on this one and collect 2 more Twinkies. And of course the keys to free Uriah.
You are no ordinary woman.
Yeah, no shit, Sherlock.
I am Carla.
Oh wait, this is Carla, not Uriah. Yeah, this game has a different Uriah, but also the same looking witch as the old Uriah, but named Carla. Well, as you guys probably already know, I can never tell which witch is which witch. Now, unfortunately, the spell Dark Edge requires 30 intelligence, and we're not there yet. Moreover, we also need souls to buy more Twinkies from Grey Rat, which means that another boss needs to die. And it kinda sucks that the old Demon King is specifically weak to dark damage and immune to frost, but I think we can manage. Although at first hand it looked a bit grim since I hardly ever fight this boss, and my go-to tactic of baiting fire breaths and moving back and forth would be way too slow. But on second hand, it turned out that once you get used to his almost Elden Ring level of delayed attacks, he's actually quite manageable, even though my damage still sucked. In fact, in the second phase he becomes easier, given that he leaves himself wide open during the meteor shower. Although I actually got stuck somehow when he was about to explode, which I only barely survived. But of course after that I could have defeated him with one arm tied behind my back. And speaking of one arm, now with Grey Rat safely returned, due to the help of Onion Bro, I had enough Twinkies to upgrade my right arm. Well, the right arm on the right right arm, that is. I mean, they're both right arms after all. And because of the Titanite slap from the DLC, it was upgraded all the way to max. And that's a good thing, because now we need to get as much damage out of a single attack as possible. Because I was thinking, and that was probably already my first mistake, but I assumed that the weapon art would be a terrible choice against Pontiff, given that we can't use it with the casters in hand, when using it as a parry tool. So switching back and forth would leave barely any time for attacks. So instead I decided to get the Soul Greatsword spell, which I could then use right after a parry. And I could also occasionally try to sneak in a snap freeze here and there. I mean, by now I had access to not one, but 2 sorcery boosting rings and the magic clutch ring. And on top of that I could use the parry loop strategy to get through the first phase rather quickly. So alright then. Sounds like I got a steady hand on the tiller. And that's it. That's really it? A fully upgraded arm, Lloyd sword ring, magic clutch ring, 2 sorcery rings. And I get about the same damage from this sorcery as 2 pimp slaps that don't even cost any FP. In fact, even the awkward switching with the weapon art got better results. Heck, even without parrying at all, I got way better results. Well, that is until I got to the second phase. Because when the clone is out, it's practically impossible to keep both of them at arm's length. Meaning that things got completely, and I mean completely, out of hand. Okay, different strategy. I suppose Dark Edge could be the solution here, but the whole problem is that I needed more levels in intelligence for that. So I decided to go and respec, sacrificing 6 levels of stamina, so that I now could use Dark Edge, and in case you don't know, that can be a pretty damn powerful spell. So Pontiff, let's see who is the biggest edgelord among us. Okay, that's still a little rough around the edges. Yeah, this is really not going the way I expected it would go. Ah, crapalicious, I would have given my right arm for the ability to do a riposte. But that's of course not an option this time. Well, the first phase was at least doable. There are enough attack windows that you can even create with the parry loop strategy, even without resorting to parries, since he not only has some attacks that you can outstrafe, but even some questionable hitboxes in your advantage, believe it or not. However, in the second phase, I pretty much had to rely almost exclusively on snap freeze, and perhaps some occasional pimp slaps or single weapon art stabs here and there. But other than the lengthy cooldown period before you can use it again, the main problem with snap freeze was that I can't even see what the hell is happening. And on top of that, Pontiff can dodge it, or you simply can't even tell if it hits him or not. In fact, I couldn't even tell the difference between whether he was still in his cooldown period, or whether it somehow simply wasn't connecting for whatever reason. So, without intending to pontificate, I think it's fair to say that this was a complete and utter mess, costing me an Ember and almost a Divine Blessing, in order to just tank my way through. This is what I would call the double Kenny method. First you die over and over again like Kenny McCormick, until you get lucky, real lucky, like Kenny of the Walking Dead variety. Anyway, after Sullivan was sullied and gone, I had access to a simple infusion for my Kestis and another Estus shard. And an incidentally interesting farming strategy, I suppose. A little slow, but it sorta works. Even the Edgelord spell finally did some work. However, against Yorm, it was surprisingly ineffective. You think it would be a great way to hit his arm and head, because of the large vertical hitbox. But no matter locked on or locked off, it's ironically not on the cutting edge of spells that cut. Meaning it's not gonna cut it. However, it turns out that the Great Heavy Soul Arrow was performing quite remarkably well in this fight, since I could hit Yorm directly in the head with it. Nevertheless, it would obviously require a ginormous amount of FP, meaning I had to reallocate my Estus mostly into the Ashen variety, which in turn meant that I had little left over for healing. And although it might sound like I would still have the upper hand that way, but when locking onto Yorm's head, the camera suddenly goes all over the place and will actually make you roll into directions that you don't want to go into. And on top of that, I had to make sure to not move too far away during the second phase, otherwise his leaping punch would surely punish me. After all, my casting speed was very low. After all, I didn't exactly have levels to spare for dexterity. I hadn't even been able to raise my strength level at all, nor did I have any free ring slots for the Sage Ring. And therefore things got pretty tense near the end, when I did have more than sufficient FP remaining, but I was completely out of healing and also low on health. In fact, I had even already used a Divine Blessing. Alright, one more hit and bruh. Come on. Really? I mean, I know it makes sense this time that I don't have a steady hand, but Yorm is being really desperate to keep his head above water. But, in the end, although he was head and shoulders above us, by quite a margin I must say, and I was a mere grasshopper in his sight, he still met his end by my hand. Unfortunately, Aldrich is highly resistant to both magic and dark damage. However, the Dancer is incredibly weak to dark. So perhaps this time, being a massive edgelord will finally pay off. And in fact, it sure did. And no, I'm not even referring to the Dark Edge spell, but the fact that I could now spank her in an even more literal way than during the Dragonstone's only run. But other than that, Dark Edge was surprisingly effective all of a sudden. So perhaps we're finally getting to the point that we can use the Broken Preacher arm as an efficient catalyst for sorceries. At least somewhat efficient. Although I still think that it's kinda weird that the arm of a preacher isn't used for miracles instead. But you know, on the other hand, it's basically the same thing anyway. I mean, when famous people behave like weirdos, you call them eccentric. When a god performs magic, you call it a miracle. Anyway, in Lothric Castle there are a whole bunch of Twinkie tits. Because remember that only my right arm is maxed out. Meaning that this will allow me to upgrade my left right arm. The right arm on the left, I think. Anyway. But Dragon Slayer armor was up next, so it's only appropriate for me to wear an exoskeleton of my own. And although I always understood this particular boss to be one of only a handful of enemies in the entire game that's weak to magic, it kinda wasn't all that impressive. And his weakness to frost makes no difference because that has nothing to do with how much damage it does. So this fight mainly came down to using the weapon arts like melee attacks. In fact, strategy-wise, it was very similar to a regular fight with a melee weapon. The main thing I had to keep in mind was that I could only attack twice in a row, or maybe 3 times if you're lucky. Because if you're going to bring the spam, he's going to eat you for breakfast. So the fight was definitely quite a bit longer than usual, meaning that, once again, the real danger in this fight was not so much the boss himself, but instead were the pernicious and perpetual projectiles of the Pilgrim Post-Pupa. However, with enough persistence on our part, eventually the armor was no more. Unfortunately, we couldn't enter the Grand Archives yet, since Aldrich was still alive. But I was still a few Twinkies short to upgrade my other arm to max, not to mention a slab. Therefore, I decided to first go and teach the king that it was not a smart decision to grant his subjects the right to bear arms, and it would be a cold day in hell for me to give them up willingly. I mean, my damage output was not exactly fit for a king, but that was at least okay when he was still holding his imaginary or possibly not so imaginary baby, depending on interpretation. However, once he violently abandons his incorporeal infant, His damage output was... wow. Huh. Actually kind of ironic that only after he gets rid of Ocelot he becomes pretty good. Well, the thing is that I kinda need Flint's ring and the Magic Lights ring to even get this rather unimpressive damage output, which I would have to give up in order to increase my defenses. But at least I could use Snap Freeze once in a while to serve as the icing on this unexpectedly not a piece of cake encounter. But what everyone would expect, of course, is that the instant charge played a huge part in that. Terrible from up close and can even hit you if you're behind him and he charges into a wall. And speaking of obstructions, that somehow nearly cost me the victory near the end. You know, I was wondering whether you could cheese Gundyr from a distance with Snap Freeze before he stands up, but he apparently doesn't have a hitbox until his health bar appears. So the inevitable fight resulted in the inevitable parry strategy, followed by Dark Edge. And contrary to Pontiff, this time it actually worked. Pretty straightforward, but he somehow survived with a single digit HP remaining. So I tried to finish with a soul arrow, but well, okay, if he doesn't want to play nice, I'll have to finish it with a spanking.
Butt scratcher! Get your butt scratcher here! Butt scratcher! Butt scratcher! Butt scratcher!
Actually, another fight that was uneventful in principle, but still quite literally threw me for a loop, was the Ancient Wyvern, given that I could now access Archdragon Peak for the final Twinkies. And of course a Titanite slab. And even though you can do a plunge attack despite the fact that you can one-shot the dragon that way with your bare hands, however, that doesn't really matter, since you can simply bait him to this position on the stairs, inflict him with frost, and then use Dark Edge on his head. I mean, all of his attacks are easy to avoid, and for the sideways fire breath, you just move along with him. So it didn't take long before the boss realized the gravity of the situation. I need a drink. Nice, grasshopper. Well, I guess I could be all up in arms about it, but it's a long established fact that the only true unbeatable boss in Souls games is the omnipotent force of gravity. Anyway, now I could get my final upgrade materials. Twinkle, twinkle, Titan night, all my scripts start with alright. And it was actually a quite dangerous experience with all the enemies around. A truly nail-biting experience. Regardless, I managed to get a slap without getting a slap. Meaning that with both weapons at +5, I could embrace any challenge coming my way with open arms. Yeah, now the gloves are definitely off. Well, sort of. These weapons would still perform very poorly against Aldrich, although it wasn't so bad when you get the double damage from hitting Gwendolyn instead. Which sounds so cruel, but that's unfortunately how damage is calculated in this fight. Regardless, I thought I could give myself a little bit of extra elbow room with the Twisted Wall of Light spell to block his arrow rain. Which, yeah, well, I am still alive at least. Twice, which does count for something, I suppose. Of course, then I immediately messed up by allowing him to heal with Life on Scythe. But I wasn't going to let that happen twice. So although it was quite a messy fight, both his defenses and his ability to outspam me didn't turn out to be too much to handle. However, would the same apply to the twin princes? I mean, both are extremely resistant to dark, so going full edgelord mode was out of the question, but Lorien is actually not all that resistant to magic, and therefore the first phase was pretty straightforward, although I had to make sure to not spam my attacks obviously. And yes, I know I could have cheesed the second phase with Snap Freeze by using the AI freeze trick, by starting the second phase behind the boss, but nah. Defeating the princess should feel like a crowning achievement. And to be fair, it kinda was, because the fight became very lengthy this way. And on top of that, my most damaging attack would leave me very vulnerable. Although this looks pretty epic, if you ask me. But against Lothric, I wouldn't be able to inflict much damage at the time, as he is very resistant to magic. And therefore I needed multiple Lorien knockdowns. And of course, since I was carrying a lot of Ashen Estus, I soon found myself out of regular Estus and low on health. So then, these poor broken arms will have to do some really heavy lifting indeed. Because if you let the panic get to you, then the left hand won't even know what the right hand is doing. And therefore, make a fist and pull yourself together. Well, then I actually kinda suddenly realized that I was using the wrong version of Soul Spear. I explicitly went and bought the crystal variety before and forgot to equip it. Therefore I decided to use it on the King of the Storm and well, it does a decent amount of damage, but not exactly worth it for the amount of FP that it costs. So therefore I just decided to go for the weapon art instead, although I had to swap my rings out mid-fight, as I need a different setup for melee attacks. And to be fair, it kinda worked out a lot better. Now, I know of course that you can cheese the Nameless King from a distance with ranged attacks, but nah, wasn't going to do that anyway. And I'm sure that the weapon art is going to function well enough. Well, that's actually not that good. But what was even worse is that I took a lot of unnecessary damage. I mean, really unnecessary damage. So what I actually had to conclude here is that what was truly ineffective was me. I was simply playing like shit. I mean, granted, the last time I played this game was 8 months ago, and the no stamina run I did back then was a very different playstyle, to say the least. But all in all, the problem was not my setup, the problem was me. So, therefore I decided to change my setup, and now I wasn't only taking unnecessary hits from being sloppy, but also from the casting speed being a lot slower than a standard melee attack. So, again, I found myself without any healing items, but he still had about half his health bar remaining. So I wanted to give up and change tactics again, but then I thought, I'm not going to let this slip through my fingers. It's time for me to make a fist, as I don't need any more healing. I know this fight as the back of my hand. I simply need to get a grasp on it once more. It's about elbow grease, putting in the work, and to give those feelings of doubt in your own abilities the cold shoulder, even when cornered against an invisible wall. Do not throw your arms up in despair, because although it may sound ham-fisted and like vain armchair philosophy, even when you are dealt a bad hand, and the weight of the world is upon your shoulders, you keep going until your fingers bleed and victory is within your grasp. And then it's yours for the taking. A king who ruled with an iron fist, dethroned by a lowly insect, ascending into the heavens above. And with that, the final boss might seem to be the only one remaining, in the main game that is. After all, we cannot just hand-wave the toughest boss fights in the game away, and therefore we're including the DLCs. By the way, combining Hidden Body with Spook is the perfect way to safely land on top of the God damn it. You'd think I would be an expert at handling branches at this point, but no. However, speaking of handling things, don't forget the Fab Ring. Although we don't exactly have any ring slots to spare anyway, because although we are doing pretty good damage per Crystal Soul Spear with our best setup, surprisingly more than with Dark Edge in fact, but given how much FP it costs, that's just not gonna work. I mean, it would already take over 2000 FP to get through the first phase, unless you get some lucky piercing shots that hit both, but it's more likely that you will occasionally miss, and of course take damage due to long casting times, which in turn cancel out Lloyd's Sword Ring. Not to mention the fact that you can't carry too many regular Estus. And an even bigger issue is that in the second phase, the boss's defenses go through the roof. No, I think it's time to take a different approach. We will need strength of a different kind. Yeah, that means I'm going to put a lot of trust in that giant D over here. But when you're out of options, the best idea is a giant D. It will still cost a lot of FP because it's going to take a lot of stabbing with my magical birches. But it's better than nothing. After all, a birch in the hand is worth 2 birds in the air. No. What was it again? Better to have 2 hands in the bush of a bird, or at least something along those lines. I know, I guess my mind is about as broken as my arms at this point in the playthrough. However, that became a lot worse in the second phase. Because the first phase was quite manageable, if you have fought this boss before with a low damage output. As long as you don't get greedy with your attacks, and move away from the incoming toxic laser in time, while paying close attention to your stamina, so that you have a little remaining to dodge the incoming attack of the demon that you're currently focused on. After all, their reach can be very deceptive. It's safer to simply assume that an attack is going to hit you, and do an unnecessary roll, than to be surprised that an attack that you fought with didn't. But of course, when a fight takes this long, you're bound to make some mistakes, or the other demon unexpectedly explodes right beside you, or whatever the hell happened here. So when one demon remained, I wasn't willing to heal, because I wanted to use an Ember instead during the phase transition. And let's say that was a scary, yet very wise decision, as you will see. But at least one-on-one, the demon is quite predictable. And you would think that would still apply to the Demon Prince. But that's only partially true. First of all, my damage went down significantly because his defenses are so incredibly high. So once more, a very lengthy fight means a lot of opportunities for things to go south. But you know what was the real danger in this fight? The walls. Because the boss by himself I was able to handle, but the walls I could not handle all that well. And I understand in an arena this freaking large that might sound like an underhanded comment, but for whatever mysterious reason, the boss was constantly, and I mean constantly, moving towards the walls. And that messes with his movement, and in turn, with your spacing. Leading from some very close calls to moments that would nearly give you a heart attack. And then you will realize that with so much Estus put into the Ashen variety, the bottom of that bottle becomes visible quicker than you should be comfortable with. Regardless, we are getting close, so better count your blessings. Which is 1. You can only hold 1 at a time, after all. Alright then, let's hop backwards on what at some point I'm sure was supposed to be grass. After all, it appears to be that this location is what remains of Fireling's shrine. Somehow. But yeah, that wasn't even the first time a Divine Blessing gave me the upper hand in this run. So I better make sure that I acquire every single one in the game. Because now I would enter the Ring City DLC to be among my kinfolk. Who may not fear the dark, but despite being part of the Hive, I don't share in their hive mind. Because I do fear the dark. Specifically of the Eater Medea variety. So before we go and deal with that, I quickly went to cheese Half-Light for the pillar with Snap Freeze. You know how you can do that with Poison Mist? After all, I refuse to make my hands dirty on him. As all he's going to get from me are my middle fingers. And what? What the fuck? Whoa, 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 what kind of bullshit is this? You're telling me that Poison Mist goes through the pillars, but Snap Freeze does not? Even for From Software's hit detection inconsistencies regarding walls, that is offensively inconsistent. Oh my god, this is ass. And I hardly do any damage. The Painting Guardian constantly heals. In fact, even stun locking doesn't work as they can somehow roll out of it. At random times. Well, at least I can finally make use of the caster's weapon art. For whatever that is worth. The problem is that Half-Light apparently has his own version of Perseverance. Oh, and I thought Medir was going to take ages. But at this rate, the bones in my arms go from broken to disintegrated into dust due to the second law of thermodynamics acting upon their molecular structure over vast eons of time. Or something along those lines at least, I don't even care. Just die and stop existing in this game, Half-Light, and also in any other possible configuration of other universal constructs within a potential ontological multiverse or even within a purely epistemic mathematical approximation of one. Ah, damn it, I need some more grasshopper. So, as I was saying, we were on our way to Medir, and unfortunately, he's immune to frost and resistant to magic. But our damage output was a nice round amount of exactly 100. So that would be 159 hits, given his total health of 15,860. But of course only if I wouldn't get hit and lose the buff from Lloyd Swordring. Which shouldn't happen because, you know, Medir is easy and predictable. What the actual fricking fuck up the fucking fricker? Oh. Huh. That might be a nice RTSR setup. In fact, that was very much intentional, of course. And now I do 102 damage per hit. Huh. Okay, not exactly worth it. Yeah, and wasting Estus is early, no. Let's just bug out of here and try again. Well, that's a less subtle way, but that kind of comes down to the same thing, I suppose. In a way, it's a shame that I got rid of my projectiles, because with a range attack, when he does his flying fire breath, I would have been able to hit Dark Eater mid-air. But at least by attacking his head from the side, I would be able to stab right into Dark Eater's mid-ear. Well, assuming that he has any ears, which I suppose he would have, given that he already doesn't have any eyes. So I suppose he uses any other sense than sight to sense where we are. Yeah, that makes sense, that's probably it. He smells us. He hears our breath. He feels our air. That's how he knows where we are, even though we are invisible to him. Well, it's a good thing he ate all the dark, otherwise I wouldn't be able to see anything either. And despite what the Locust Preachers might say, I do in fact have fear of the dark. I have a constant fear that someone's always near. You might even say that I have a phobia that someone's always there. I mean, have you ever been alone at night and you thought you heard footsteps behind, and you turned around and no one's there? And then as you quicken up your pace, you find it hard to look again, because you're sure there's someone there? Yeah, I definitely have a lot of fear of the dark. And speaking of acting out of fear, you've probably heard of panic rolling before, but here's a new term for you. Panic blessing. Well, still better than panic dying, I suppose.
Too old for this shit.
However, with one Dark Eater down, we still have another one left to go. Namely a Dark Soul Eater.
Hand it over, that thing, your dark soul.
Hand over your Dark Soul? Well, you can pry it from my cold, dead, broken hands. For even you will have to bow down to the power of my magical bows. Or, well, lack thereof. Because unfortunately, Gale is also quite resistant to magic damage. But he is at least susceptible to frostbite. Although I initially relied mostly on some good old-fashioned transient twig tickling, since you have to be very careful when to choose a long casting animation against a hyper-aggressive enemy like Gale. And although you might think he becomes a little more passive in the second phase, well, sort of, but given that he can pull out his crossbow at any time, yeah. Better to wait until after he jumps, or right after he already fired his crossbow. However, in the final phase, I kinda reverted back to my old school SL1 strategy of solely punishing the big jumping combo. Because I kind of forgot how to bait out any other attack opportunities. I mean, the last time I fought him was in the no stamina run, And let's say he didn't quite move around as much because of a particular strategy I had to use. And I wasn't going to use that same tactic again. However, that did imply that the fight went on and on and on for a very long time. Mainly relying on frostbite or the occasional sorcery stick stabbing when he was already frostbitten. But eventually, and I mean eventually, I overcame my fear of the dark, and it was my time to begin feasting upon the dark soul of man. Since lore-wise, I had quite literally the entire thing in my possession now. Regardless, you might as well say that the feast was nearing its end, as only one more DLC remained. And Frida might be immune to frost, but being a player-like character, she also lacks something that we lack as well, if it weren't for our perseverance. Poise. Meaning that we could go full stick insect mode for pretty much an entire stamina bar's worth. Of course, keeping in mind to leave a little bit to avoid a possible retaliation. Of course, I don't always follow my own advice, but hey, you're probably used to that by now. Now, for whatever reason, Father Ariandel is not immune to frostbite. Even though he constantly gets engulfed in Frida's exploding ice crystals, which on a side note was the original DS3 challenge run I had in mind for this video, but I'll just keep it on hand for later perhaps. But the thing is that Ariandel probably isn't affected by it since it would count as friendly fire. Although his fire is of course anything but friendly towards us. However, Frida herself is even more unkind and downright rude to barge in while I'm focusing on her daddy, because just like using throwables, weapon arts cause her to start dashing towards you. And combine that with all the healing she does, and the result was that I had little healing of my own left at the start of the third phase. Now fortunately the same principle from the first phase applies. Well, except for one thing, because now, even when you leave a little bit of stamina remaining, Frida can suddenly pull out a pre-Elden Ring 10-hit combo, or she can jump away before you can even get an attack in the first place. Now fortunately there are several attack opportunities, like after all the varieties of her jump attacks, and as long as you dodge straight into her, her grab attack is yet another opportunity. So that's helpful, but of course it wouldn't be a press continue video if I wouldn't make things really tense and scary at the end by making some quite unnecessary mistakes. But of course that's just intentional to create some much needed suspense, obviously. But now, I can feel the ultimate victory on my fingertips, with only the final boss remaining. And despite the fact that he is literally on fire and the embodiment of all previous Lords of Cinder, he is still susceptible to frostbite, although his resistance to it is quite high. So given his immense aggression, I was better off using the weapon art. At least initially, and sparingly at that. In fact, ironically, he leaves himself most open during his magic phase. Although, for once, I could actually counter his mist with my own during his pyro phase. And during his miracle phase I made sure to counter his healing, which he didn't seem to appreciate that much. By the way, speaking of frozen mist, a lot of you might not be aware of this, but it's not possible to defeat Soul of Cinder using that type of attack alone. Since depleting his HP to 0 is not what triggers his phase transition. You will need a direct damage source when he's below a certain threshold. In fact, summons cannot even trigger her second phase with any kind of attack. And speaking of the Frozen Mist and his second phase, it's the perfect counter for the giant wombo combo. In fact, I eventually began to kind of relying on that, because I was playing so incredibly sloppy once again. And yeah, really, I'm not doing that on purpose, although I can understand why you would think that at this point. But who could have possibly seen this coming? I found myself, once again, out of healing items, and he had still most of his health remaining. Yeah, surprise, surprise. And there we are, Dark Souls 3 defeated with 2 broken arms. Literally very handy, figuratively really not that handy. But we've definitely proven ourselves to be handy capable. And although I think I should have gone for the Lord of Hollows ending, because I would have taken Henri's hand in marriage, but given that we now truly have learned to not fear the dark, we're going to submerge the entire world in it. Nah, I'm a locust, a pest. I consume other people's stuff. So that flame belongs in my greedy hands.